Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. So today I am back to talk about the books that I read for Her-Storyathon. Now you will have heard me mention Her-Storyathon quite a few times. It is the read-along that I host every March. I say every March, we've been doing this for 2 years now, but with Brittany over at Literally Smitten, where we are basically celebrating women through history, asking you to participate and to challenge you to read as many books as you can about fantastic women through history. Each year we do stress, of course, that you only have to read one book that is women's history in order to participate in this month, but we also do a little prompt bingo sheet, which I will put right here, in order just to make it a little bit more challenging and a little bit more fun. During March I ended up reading 15 books and 10 of those books ended up being relevant for Her-Storyathon, and I'm very pleased to say that this year I ended up meeting all 9 prompts and reading the group book, which I'm really proud of myself for. Last year I think I ended up reading 8 out of 9. I was so close but yet so far. And so yeah, today I'm going to talk about all 10 books in a kind of vague order of how much I liked them. I will say there were no absolute duds in this lineup of books, just, you know, some books that I thought were fine but not my favourites, all the way up to my new favourite book of the year. So because there are quite a few books to get through, let's just get straight to them. The first book I have to show you today is Glass Town by Isabelle Greenberg. This is a graphic novel which is retelling the lives of the Bronte children, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, and Branwell, but particularly looking at the world that they created in their juvenilia. The book starts off with an older Charlotte, long after all of her other siblings have died, being invited by this mysterious figure to look back on her past. And this is basically trying to retell some of those old stories and also offer a little bit of a psychology analysis into these characters, including Charlotte herself. It's funny because looking on Goodreads, I feel like I have an opposite opinion about this to a lot of other people. A lot of other people have said that they didn't really like the art style of this, but they love the story, whereas I'm completely the opposite. I actually think the artistry in here is really beautiful. I feel like it really fits for the world that they've created, and also just generally for the Brontes themselves. I'd seen a lot of people saying that they thought it was a bit too gloomy, but I thought, you know, it is Haworth. It is the Brontes, so what were you expecting? I don't want to be as harsh as saying it was style over substance, but for me it was a very pretty book, but I thought the story was a bit meh. I found the back and forth of the narrative a little bit disorienting. We would be going from adult Charlotte to child Charlotte and her stories back and forth, and I just didn't really feel like there was a good flow or rhyme and reason for it. I also wonder if, because I haven't actually read the juvenilia in full of the Brontes, maybe a lot of this just didn't land for me, and maybe if I were to read that juvenilia and then come back to this, maybe I'd appreciate it a bit more. I also found the aspect of older Charlotte having interactions and relationships with some of her characters that she created as a child just a little bit weird as well. I think there's one point where one of them actually declares love for her and I was just like, Arr. So yeah, for me, very pretty, but story just a bit Then next up we have Why She Wrote, a graphic history of the lives, inspiration and influence behind the pens of classic women writers by Burke and Hannah K. Chapman. Continuing on with a Her-Storyathon trend of just graphic novels or history with graphic elements thrown in, just kind of not landing for me. This is part text biography and part graphic novel, retelling the lives of many famous writers such as Jane Austen, Mary Wollstonecraft, Anne Lister. You know, it's a lovely little thing. I can see this being a really great gift, but I often just didn't understand why certain parts of these narratives, these biographies, were being turned into the graphic novel. It didn't feel like these always flowed very naturally on from the text. Last year I'd read Bookish Broads, which was another one which had a small snippet of biography to a very beautiful image, very beautiful illustration of that figure. And you might remember last year my main criticism of that book was that though the illustrations were beautiful, I was finding like little inaccuracies in the text, and that really just took me out of it. But what I will say for that book is that as much as it did have inaccuracies, at least the illustrations in there actually stuck with me, whereas these illustrations I just found a little bit dull. I didn't really like the art style in here. I don't really see what these illustrations really added. So this book just ends up being like illustrations that are not great, and then text that is only surface level because you're cramming in so many different authors, and yeah, all I'm left with is like a pretty front cover, but not a lot of substance for me. Oh, that felt really harsh, I'm sorry. Another little essay that I got to was Sex and the City of Ladies by Lisa Hilton, rewriting history with Cleopatra, Lucrezia Borgia and Catherine the Great. The title being a reference to medieval writer Christine de Pizan and her book The City of Ladies, which was her big defence of women and her criticism of fellow medieval writers who had been degrading women. And in that book she discusses many different women of history and of mythology to kind of show examples to to her contemporary male writers to say kind of like, hey, women are worth something. Here are all of these examples of fantastic women. This book kind of takes that concept on, and is actually a bit of a criticism of Christine de Pizan for women that she would have left out. Lisa Hilton's main contention being that Christine Pizan would have barred some of these women that she's talking about based on their scandals and controversies, and particularly their sexual history. Hence the title, Sex and the City of Ladies. And as the subtitle suggests, we are mainly looking at case studies of Cleopatra, who Christine de Pizan would have known about. But then we have Lucrezia Borgia and Catherine the Great, who came after Christine de Pizan. What this book ends up being really is more of a retelling of these women's biographies. And you know, it's enjoyable. I always like learning about these women, but I did wonder how necessary it was as a book to basically this being whittled down to having 3 biographies of 3 women who are very, very well known, who we do know the biographies of, and whom modern historians are reappraising and have been depicting in a more feminist manner. Like, I don't know really what this book is offering. Christine de Pizan, as the author herself points out, is far less known. Wouldn't it have been more interesting to get a bit of an insight into her? So yeah, to be honest, I wasn't really sure what this book was offering, but you know, I enjoyed my time with it whilst I was reading. Next up we have When I Dare to Be Powerful, which is collected essays by Audre Lorde, which includes some of her most famous essays about being black, being a lesbian, being a feminist, and all of the intersections within that. I think some of the most notable ones being Eye to Eye. These essays I found really, really beautiful and really powerful. However, the reason that it's ranking a bit lower on this list is because I do not actually think that this essay collection is one that is meant for a readathon, and I don't think I was in the right headspace to read this. I think these are essays that really need a bit of dedicated time to sit down with them and really study them, and I don't think Her-Storyathon was really the best venue for that. I felt like I was getting a lot of like little great nuggets of wisdom, but I wasn't really taking everything in. So in this case, it is absolutely me and not the book itself. For me, this is one that I definitely need to come back to later. Next up we have Letters of Great Women, Extraordinary Correspondence from History's Remarkable Women by Lucinda Hawksley. This stunning book basically takes individual letters from different women of history, providing a short biography of their lives, maybe an illustration, and then gives us both the original letter as it was handwritten or typed, and then a transcript, so that it is a lot easier for us to read. Women included in here include Cleopatra, Charlotte Bronte, Anne Lister, Catherine of Aragon, Nina Simone, all the way through to Greta Thunberg. This is another one that I think would make an absolutely fantastic gift, and I did really enjoy reading this. As I've said before, when you've got these short little biographies preceding a letter or an image, you do often, if you know that figure very, very well, end up finding the book falling into generalizations. These especially being like multiple paragraphs long rather than a couple of sentences. They're long enough to include more detail, but also short enough that sometimes the author has to take shortcuts with the history that they're giving you. I also feel like for Her-Storyathon in the future, if I'm going to be picking up a letter collection, it will be like letters around one individual woman, or maybe a letter collection that is based around some sort of theme. I feel like that will work a little bit better for me. Like I said, I did enjoy this, but you know, with my critical hat on, there were moments where I was like, okay, so why is it that you picked this particular letter? Why is it that you chose this particular person to include rather than somebody else? I feel like I'm being a little bit harsh today. I don't know. Maybe it's just too bright in this room. Next up we have Hidden Figures by Margot Shetterley, telling the story of the different black women who worked for NASA on their space program, working as human calculators, calculating the equations and other mathematics behind their launches, but particularly focusing on Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson, working in this very high-pressured environment where it's the beginning of the Cold War. There is great pressure by the US government on NASA to be able to compete with Russia's aims in space. But also during this book we are approaching and entering the civil rights movement, the rights of black people in the US being a very contested space, and yet you've got these women in the middle of all of this trying to live their lives and do their work, and everything that they have to come up against. This I thought was really, really great, especially after having loved the film. It was really great to get more in-depth in understanding of this history, particularly like areas where the film was a bit more dramatized, where certain storylines were condensed. This has a much longer time frame than I was expecting. It's a very interesting one for analysis of book to film adaptation. Characters getting condensed, timelines getting condensed. You've got this trio, Catherine, Dorothy and Mary, within the film, who very much function like a trio, whereas they don't really seem to interact very much in the book. Also, always remarkable for a book about space and about science and mathematics to be able to hold my attention for any length of time. So well done for that, Margot Shetterley. But yes, this is a very, very important history. I think it's one that everybody absolutely has to read. Just get a bit more appreciation for these fantastic women. Next up we have Joan by Catherine J. Chen, historical fiction retelling the life of Joan of Arc. I don't know quite what I was expecting of this, but it wasn't what I got, and this kind of surpassed a lot of my expectations. I mean, I thought I was going to like it, but I didn't think this would have me like thinking quite as much as it did. Something I should point out about this book straight away for anybody wondering, the Joan that appears in this book is not one who has prophetic religious visions. She herself is not particularly religiously inspired, which I think is going to be like the main point of controversy that might turn people off of this book. Joan is religious to an extent, like religion is not absent from this book, but her desire to fight is a lot more pragmatic rather than divinely inspired. This book paints a portrait much more about how Joan is being used, and particularly how religion is being used upon Joan by others to push their own agendas. This is really a story about a girl who has been used and abused by everybody in her life, and ways that she fights against this, but also ways that she just kind of goes along with it. But it's really sad to see how everybody from her father to the King of France just kind of see her as disposable and see her as useful to a certain extent, and when her use to them expires, they don't want anything to do with her anymore. One of my notes says it's about the fickleness of royal favour, but really it's about the fickleness pretty much of everybody. It's another historical fiction that is incredibly atmospheric. There's a nice big quote on the front from Hilary Mantel, and I can definitely see comparisons being made to Hilary Mantel's writing. She's not quite on a Thomas Cromwell level, but she's definitely a character who notices a lot that is happening around her, and that really comes through in the narrative. It just feels very, very real, very tangible. And yeah, I thought this was fantastic. Next up we have The Once and Future Sex, Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society by Eleanor Janega. This is non-fiction history, basically taking us through all of the different expectations on medieval women, from how they were desired to look, think, work, how they were meant to have sex, that were put on them in literary and other sources through the time, through that 1,000-year period. It's a book that is very much about how progress and expectations for women have fluctuated over time. It's a book very much with the argument that progress, particularly for women, is never linear. I really, really like this. It's very, very well researched. I feel like the way that it was set up was really clear and understandable. Eleanor Janega also has this very like funny, ironic tone, which I quite enjoy. This book also taught me, and I'm slightly ashamed to admit this as somebody who grew up Catholic, but this was the book that taught me what Immaculate Conception is. I've spent 28 years of my life believing that the Immaculate Conception was the conception of Jesus, but actually it is the conception of Mary as a sinless being. I don't know how I didn't know that, but I didn't. 18 years of going to church every Sunday, and it all led to this. Oh dear. Who says that you can't learn anything out of school? Next up we have Women vs Hollywood, The Fall and Rise of Women in Film by Helen O'Hara. This was actually the group read for Her-Storyathon this year, and I'm unsure as to whether or not Brittany and myself are going to be doing a very delayed, belated live stream about this. So I'm only going to give brief thoughts about this now, but as you might be able to tell from the position of this in the list, I really, really enjoyed this. This for me was just a fantastic whistle-stop tour of the last century in film, going from the very beginnings of filmmaking in France all the way up to modern day Hollywood, with occasional like case studies on different individuals in between. I particularly loved learning about the silent film era and basically just like how dominant women were within the silent film industry, and it's something that I just didn't know anything about before. Once again, really, really enjoy Helen O'Hara's tone in this. She clearly knows so much about this industry and its history, and this is packed through with lots of details and lots of film recommendations, but she also, once again, has this really funny tone that is quite snarky and funny, which is kind of needed amidst all of the like depressing and frankly kind of horrifying stories that she's retelling. She's also somebody who doesn't just kind of like lay out all of the horror and offer no solutions for this. When you get to the end of this, you can kind of see how things can teeter one way or another depending on what Hollywood decides to do. And yeah, as I say, I don't want to say too much now in case we do that live show, but I really, really enjoyed this. I think even if you were not a massive like Hollywood film buff, which I'm definitely not, there's still a lot to get out of this. Penultimate book I have to show you today is Lady Macbethad by Isabelle Schuler, which is historical fiction, which basically takes the life of Gruyck, who would go on to be the wife of Macbethad, who would end up being the King of Scots, and basically kind of invents a backstory, a childhood, and a young life for out of the very few sources that we do have for her, which kind of makes it a bit of an odd choice for Her-Storyathon. It is definitely much more fictional and a little less history, but it is about a real person who did exist, so I'm including it. And of course, sprinkled in are occasional, quite light references to the play Macbeth, which are always quite enjoyable. And I wasn't sure what to expect of this, especially having not really liked Learwife last year. I had such a good time with this book. I got very, very invested in these characters, even though most of them are pretty despicable. I found looking at this main character of Gruyck, who we are seeing from being a young child up to, you know, relatively young adulthood. She's not really the Lady Macbeth figure that you would expect, but we're seeing little inklings of that personality and seeing that develop and grow. Little pockets of deception and treachery, but this is not a fully formed woman yet. This is somebody whose life could have gone down different paths. And I felt like Isabelle Schuler did a really great job at kind of portraying that. Something I wasn't expecting from this is how long we have to wait for some of the inevitable things that do happen in this book to happen. I don't want to spoil it too much, but yeah, this had me on the edge of my seat for quite a long time, but the payoff was really worth it. Once again, it is another historical fiction book that is just dripping in atmosphere. I love how lots of different historical details and literary details and allusions are scattered throughout this book. I will say that 10th, 11th century Scotland is not my area of expertise, so I can't speak for a lot of the veracity in this, but once again, it is one that felt very real, with a couple of, slightly magical twists to it, but not too much. The right amount for me, at least. And yeah, I need to stop saying it for every book, but I really enjoyed this. And then last but not least, my favourite book that I read during Her-Storyathon was Elizabeth of York, The Last White Rose by Alison Weir. Last year I read the complete 6 Tudor Queens series by Alison Weir, and now she's moved on to a different series, the Tudor Rose series, starting with Elizabeth of York. I think the next book in the series is going to be focused on Henry VIII, and I think after that is going to be Mary I. And this basically follows that trajectory that she set with those previous books, where we're going from that figure quite young in life all the way up to their deaths. Elizabeth of York is a figure in Tudor and late medieval history who I find really fascinating, and I feel like not a lot of other people do. But she's someone who just lived through a lot of history, and even though maybe she was not like a direct participant in a lot of it, it would be so interesting to know what she thought, what was going through her mind, and that's exactly what Alison Weir is able to present in this book, taking us from her early life in the court of her father Edward IV. I believe the book starts off with one of the conflicts during the Wars of the Roses, where Edward has had to flee, and her mother Elizabeth Woodville has had to scoop up all the children and take them into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. And then from there, it's basically just one thing after another for her. All I kept thinking through this book was just, oh, poor thing. You have like this small moment of peace during her father's reign, and then he dies, and then basically just everything hits the fan. You have the disappearance of her 2 brothers, the princes in the tower, the reign of her uncle Richard III, and Alison Weir does confront head on the rumour about her relationship with her uncle and the evidence that Richard was looking to marry Elizabeth, his niece, after his own wife Anne Neville died. We have the Battle of Bosworth, Henry VII being victorious, Elizabeth's marriage to Henry, and the birth of all of their children, and then all of the different pretenders to the throne and how this impacts on Elizabeth and Henry. And you're basically just getting a chance to see a portrait into Elizabeth's psychology, into how all of these conflicts are really weighing on her and how she's able to keep any sort of clarity through this entire life. I have no idea. As I say, it is just one thing after another for poor Elizabeth. And I think the fact that she is such a quiet figure within the historical sources, the fact that we don't know quite so much about her actually really works to Alison Weir's advantage, because you're not kind of balancing lots of conflicting ideas about this person in your mind, as I think you would be for someone like Anne Boleyn. I could see a lot of parallels between this and Jane Seymour, which was my favourite of the 6 Tudor Queens. And I don't know out of Elizabeth of York and Jane Seymour which one of those 2 books would win, would beat the other out, but no, I had a fantastic time with this so far. This has probably been my favourite book of the year, and as I often have with the end of these books, just kind of feeling a bit of a loss that it was over, even though it was such a chunky book. So that's a pretty good sign, I think. So there we go, those are all of the books that I read for Her-Storyathon in March. Do let me know if you have read any of the books I've spoken about today, or if you're interested in them. Also, please let me know what you read during Her-Storyathon. I would love to get any recommendations that you have, particularly if they fit some of the prompts. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.